Hi, I'm Tim, guitar player, teacher. In the last video, we added another note to our triads to create seventh chords. These chords are commonly found in modern music and are built by simply adding another interval of either a major or minor third on top of one of the triads. In this video, we're going to take a look at the inversions for each of these chords. Once again, we will be looking at close voicings and we'll be using C as the root for each of our examples. Inversions are defined by which chord tone is in the bass note of the chord. In a triad, there are only 3 notes, so there are 3 possible inversions. A root position chord has the root as the bass note. A first inversion chord uses the third as the bass note. A second inversion chord has the fifth as the bass note. When we add another note to the chord, as we do in our seventh chords, we are also adding another possible inversion called the third inversion. Following the same concept of how we got our other inversions, a third inversion would have the seventh as the bass note. The rest of the chord tones do not necessarily have to be in any particular order. The only note that matters when naming an inversion is the bass note. There's really nothing new about the way these inversions are labeled using modern chord notation. We simply have the name of the chord followed by a /, then the bass note of the chord. And as long as the bass note is one of the notes of the chord, it's an inversion. Whichever chord tone is being used as the bass note tells us which inversion it is. So, for example, a C major 7 chord has 4 positions. Root position, labeled simply C major 7. The first inversion, labeled C major 7 over E. The second inversion, labeled C major 7 over G. And the third inversion, labeled C major 7 over B. When dealing with the other notation for labeling inversions, it gets a little more complicated. Remember, this method of labeling inversions is not used with modern chord notation, so the examples I show are actually incorrect, but only in that I combined modern chord symbols with functional inversion notation. I'll do my best to make that apparent, but the important thing to take away from this is the inversion notation, because we will be seeing it again. As you recall, this method of labeling inversions deals with notating the actual intervals that are being used to build the chord. Our triads use the following. Root position using a third and a fifth, but remember the third and the fifth from the bass note do not need to be notated, they are assumed. First inversion using a third and a sixth, and second inversion using a fourth and a sixth. For a root position 7th chord, we are simply adding another interval to the chord, a 7th. So it uses a third, a fifth, and a 7th. Since the third and the fifth do not need to be written, we are left with only the 7. Now again, I have to stress that this is not to be confused with the modern chord symbol for a dominant 7 chord, which is also simply the number 7. These two methods of chord notation, modern chord symbols with this type of inversion notation, should not be used together. For the first inversion, we would have a third, a fifth, and a sixth. Since the third and the fifth do not need to be written, we are left with simply the 6. However, this is the same notation as a first inversion triad. We need a way to notate this inversion that separates it from the triad, otherwise there would be no way of knowing whether it is indicating the triad or the 7th chord. The way we differentiate it is by focusing more on the interval between the 7th and the root and only notating those 2 intervals. No matter where it is found within the chord, the interval between the 7th and the root is a second. So from the bass note, this would be created by having 2 intervals that are 1 scale tone away from each other. In the case of the first inversion, they would be the 5th and the 6th. The 7th of the chord is a 5th above the bass note, and the root of the chord is a 6th above the bass note. Therefore, a first inversion 7th chord would be notated with a 5 and a 6. For the second inversion chord, we're using a third, a fourth, and a 6th. Just like the first inversion, we need to notate the position of the 7th of the chord and the root of the chord. The 7th is found a third above the bass note, and the root is found a fourth above the bass note. Therefore, this inversion would be notated with a 3 and a 4. For the third inversion, we're using a second, a fourth, and a 6th. This one's a little different than the other two because the seventh of the chord is actually the bass note. This means the root of the chord is found a second above the bass note. So the first number in our inversion notation would be a 2. That is the key indicator that we are using the third inversion of the chord. The only way we could have a second as the first interval would be if the seventh and the root were the first two notes of the chord. We also notate the fourth, so a third inversion is notated with a 2 and a 4. Here are the symbols used for each of these seventh chord inversions: root position, first inversion, second inversion, and third inversion. These can be a little hard to remember at first. Just keep in mind each one is designed to show the position of the seventh and the root of the chord. I personally think the best way to memorize it is to simply use it. Spell any chord, a seventh chord or a triad, invert it, then try to recognize the interval structure it uses. Before long, you'll start to get a grip on which one is which, and these symbols will become part of how you think of each of these chords. Now that being said, this method of notating inversions is only used when doing harmonic analysis and figured bass, which we will get into later, so I wouldn't worry about it too much right now. The modern method of notating inversions is much more common, being modern and all, and will suffice for the time being. So far in this series, we've talked a great deal about scales and chords individually as the basic foundations for melody and harmony. In the next video, we're going to look at how these two concepts relate to each other by applying harmony, or harmonizing, the major scale. Until then, thanks for watching. Check the description for a link to downloadable files that will hopefully help in learning this and the other videos in this series, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to learn more about music theory. Again, thanks for your time. I greatly appreciate it. Take care.